Hello everyone, this is Rebecca Arvin with the Water Environment Federation. I want to welcome each of you to the Integrated Planning, Understanding How to Approach Affordability and Available Resources webcast. Before we begin, I would like to quickly review a few logistics. All of the PDF PowerPoint presentations are available for downloading at WEF's SGP link. This link was distributed via email yesterday and will be distributed again tomorrow for anyone that registered after the time of distribution. I also wanted to note that the handouts were updated this morning, so if you accessed it yesterday, you might want to access it again today. The SGP link for this webcast also has information on how to receive professional development hours for those eligible to receive these training credits. There are 2 PDH credits for this webcast. You will need to complete the evaluation form to receive the PDH certificate. Your feedback on this webcast is important and helps identify future webcast topics that are timely and helpful to you. Please follow the PDH instructions and check with your state accreditation agency on how to receive this credit. During this webcast, while you cannot speak directly to the presenters, you will, however, have an opportunity to submit questions by typing in your specific question via the pane that appears on your PC. Today's moderator, Linda Blankenship, will be accumulating questions and direct them to the presenters throughout the webcast. You will be recording this webcast. A link will be sent to all registered users tomorrow so that you can share it with other colleagues who could not attend the webcast. If you have any additional questions after the webcast is ended, please email webcast with an S at wef.org. Before we get started, I have a poll question for everyone. Let me go ahead and launch that. The question is, how many people are participating in the webcast today at your computer? If you're participating by yourself, please respond 1. If you're participating in a conference room, if you could do a quick head count, that would be great. And I'll just give that a few seconds for the results to come in. It looks like we have about 80% right now. All right, thank you so much. I'll go ahead and share those with you. Looks like we have about 85% participating by themselves today. So first I'd like to introduce Lisa McFadden. She's going to make a few opening remarks on behalf of WEF. Lisa is the Senior Program Manager in the Water Science Engineering Center here at WEF.
Thanks, Rebecca. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you on behalf of WEF for joining us today. We here at WEF are happy to be co-hosting this webinar with NACWA. We've also enjoyed co-hosting the many workshops with EPA, ACWA, and NACWA across the country. We're all dedicated to working together, along with municipalities, states, and the general public to support widespread implementation of the integrated planning framework in order to realize our shared goals of protecting human health and improving water quality. This webinar is part of that continuous effort. Additionally, WEF commends EPA on the Clean Water Act Integrated Planning Framework, the subsequent frequently asked questions helping to clarify key elements of the framework, and the current dialogue on affordability and EPA's willingness to try to further clarify its elements. And finally, for their commitment to ensuring widespread implementation of this common sense approach to achieving clean water improvements. Faced with a struggling economy and multi-year declines in revenues, now more than ever, it is imperative that local governments invest these limited resources where they will have the most significant environmental and public health impact. The affordability issue is at the center of this effort, and understanding it is the key focus of our webinar today. So as we continue our joint efforts, the Integrated Planning Framework is the springboard for greater collaboration and partnership to find the best, most innovative and cost-effective solutions to water quality improvement without saddling our communities with unnecessary debt and imposing a financial burden that is unsustainable. Understanding affordability, working together to clarify its elements, and continue to offer resources and tools to our communities to better apply it will together bring about results. So on behalf of WEF, welcome to the webinar today. I'd now like to pass the microphone over to Chris Hornback to provide additional opening remarks. Chris is the Senior Director for Regulatory Affairs at NACWA. Chris?
Thanks, Lisa. Let me just start by echoing your comments. You know, I think it's safe to say that integrated planning is an important step forward. EPA has opened a crack in the door to greater flexibility, and we need to take advantage of that opening. It's important to keep in mind that, you know, integrated planning doesn't have to be a one-size-fits-all initiative, which I think it has sort of taken on that impression. It's not just for CSO communities or those currently facing affordability concerns, though it definitely promises to be very helpful to those communities. Integrated plans, as you'll hear later today, and as we've been seeing across the country, can come in all shapes and sizes. And it's up to the utility, really, to decide what they want to include. And some communities are getting creative and exploring integrated planning from a number of different angles. We've heard of communities working, obviously, in the wet weather area, but also on nutrients, water quality-based effluent limits, including for pollutants like ammonia. And some communities are coming up with approaches that EPA didn't initially contemplate when they issued their integrated planning framework. Since the framework was released back in June of 2012, NACWA has been focused on implementation and getting communities to really put EPA's offer of flexibility to the test, which is why, as Lisa mentioned, NACWA has already organized and convened 6 regional workshops across the country in collaboration with WEF, collaboration with the Association of Clean Water Administrators and others, and why we are planning more workshops in the next year. It's safe to say that many utilities are in a wait-and-see mode on integrated planning to see how the early adopters fare. And we really are still waiting for some good final case studies to help blaze the trail for the rest of everyone. This wait-and-see approach certainly may be prudent for some, but also I think it's important to note that there are likely opportunities for more creative solutions and greater flexibility available to some of these early adopters. WEF has certainly lined up a great group of speakers for today's webcast. As you'll hear, and as Lisa mentioned, the issue of affordability and the pace at which communities can make the needed investments is really at the heart of integrated planning. As an industry, we're definitely making some progress chipping away at EPA's inflexible approach to evaluating affordability and community financial capability, but more work is definitely needed. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Linda Blankenship. Linda is the chair of WEF's Government Affairs Regulatory Subcommittee and Assistant Vice President at Michael Baker International, and she'll be moderating today's webcast. Linda?
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Lisa, as well, for those opening remarks. And I just want to add my welcome to all the participants and say that the Government Affairs Committee has been very active throughout the development and the subsequent implementation as it's going forward of the integrated planning approach. And we've been participants active at the listening sessions, at the workshops, and we're very much wanting to see that this approach moves forward and can benefit the WEF membership and certainly the larger regulated community. So we're very happy to have the degree of participation that we have in today's webinar, and certainly I think information exchange like this kind of effort will be critical in getting the results that we're hoping for and improving public health and environmental protection in an affordable way. So Rebecca, if you could just go to the next slide, please. So our agenda today is really designed to give us a broad overview and understanding of integrated planning, as well as a case study, and to present a tool, a guidance document on affordability. We have a great lineup of speakers. Erica Powers is going to introduce the integrated planning approach. Adrian Nomura will talk about the affordability issues. Gary Shealy will talk about how it's being addressed at Lima, Ohio. And then Bob Rauscher will talk about this guidance document that has been developed to give utilities a broader set of tools for assessing affordability. Next slide, please. So what we're really hoping for with the presentation is that utilities take away that we understand the struggle to comply with the multiple Clean Water Act mandates, combined sewer overflow controls, sanitary sewer overflow abatement, various mandates to update wastewater treatment plants and stormwater infrastructure. So the integrated planning framework principles really do offer an innovative and sensible approach to Clean Water Act planning. And while not every community may want to consider or intend to submit a formal plan, we think that they are very good principles for every utility to be thinking about and thinking about how to apply to their own particular situation. So as we go throughout the agenda today, what we'll do is each speaker will present on their topic. We'll spend a little time with any questions for that particular speaker, and then I anticipate that we'll have some time at the end as well for a broader Q&A. So with that, go to the next slide, please. So our first speaker is Erica Powers, and Erica is a partner in the Chicago office of Barnes & Thornburg. She advises municipalities, utilities, trade organizations, and other entities on a wide variety of Clean Water Act issues, including wet weather management, wastewater treatment, water quality standards, and enforcement and compliance issues. Her experience includes negotiating and modifying consent decrees with state and federal agencies, developing CSO and SSO plans, and other relevant experience. She has BA and JD degrees and is admitted to practice in the Illinois and Michigan state courts. So now I'd like to turn it over to Erica.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. And I also would like to thank WEF and NACWA for giving me the opportunity to talk with all of you today. What I hope to do is give you an overview of integrated planning, how we got here, what's involved, and answer some of these questions before we get into a more detailed discussion of affordability issues with our later speakers. So what I'm hoping is that this presentation will give you some tools to help evaluate whether integrated planning can help your community to better address your Clean Water Act obligations in an affordable way. So we're going to go through these questions, and feel free to type your questions in the box, and at the end we'll have some time for discussion. So first of all, what is integrated planning? The concept arose a few years ago, starting with the Conference of Mayors. A lot of communities have gotten together, and the mayors raised a number of issues that communities were experiencing across the country. They felt that there was substantial flexibility in existing law and regulations, but that EPA, regions, and the Department of Justice in particular, and enforcement actions were not using that flexibility to give communities help in meeting their Clean Water Act obligations. In addition, of course, after 2008, we saw increasing affordability challenges across the country, which led to problems implementing Clean Water Act obligations and the need for not only relief from some of those obligations, but also longer-term implementation schedules. So from the Conference of Mayors demands, that kind of led to a dialogue among EPA, the mayors, WEF, NACWA, and lots of other groups that represented affected communities. They talked not only about the issues that the mayors had raised initially, but also some other problems that were coming up in negotiations with the agency, difficulties accommodating green infrastructure initiatives, kind of a silo approach that the agency was taking to address Clean Water Act issues. You might deal with stormwater folks on one matter, permitting folks on another, CSO program folks and TMDL program folks, and none of them necessarily talked. So that's presented some problems for communities in trying to meet all of their Clean Water Act obligations at the same time. In addition, we saw substantial problems adapting to future requirements. So, for example, communities would agree to a CSO long-term control plan at a very high cost, a high median household income percentage, and then maybe a new state nutrient criteria would come along that would be very expensive to meet and require upgrades to a wastewater treatment plant. There just wasn't a good mechanism to incorporate those future requirements into decision making. And the communities across the country were concerned that the agency wasn't taking affordability issues into consideration and were really treating communities as criminals when they're just struggling to address all of their obligations with limited resources. So from this dialogue, EPA actually responded to the concerns that were raised by communities through the mayors, through WEF, through NACWA, and other organizations. And what you see here is kind of a timeline. They worked fairly quickly. We saw a draft in October 2011. There was a series of national workshops that WEF and NACWA helped to host. And the agency accepted comments and came out with the final framework in June 2012. They also have been working more on affordability issues. There was a draft affordability paper out in the beginning of the year. A frequently asked questions document about the framework, the integrated planning framework itself came out in July. And EPA has provided the mayors with an updated affordability framework this fall. It's not yet been widely distributed, but we hope to see that publicly soon. So what is in the integrated planning initiative itself? The framework elements I'm going to highlight here, they first ask you to talk about the issues that you're going to address in terms of water quality and human health impacts and regulatory issues that you need to deal with. They ask for a description of existing systems and performance, so where are you now? They ask you to put a public participation plan in place to accept public input as you work through the issues. And then they require an alternatives analysis. This is similar to the long-term planning control plan process that CSO communities are familiar with, to identify, evaluate, and select alternatives and propose implementation schedules. The final two elements of the integrated planning framework are measuring success as you're implementing the plan, and then plan improvements to incorporate the new requirements and using kind of adaptive management concepts. And finally, implementation is part of the integrated planning framework, and implementation can be through any kind of enforceable document, permits. It could be a series of enforceable permits that contain, progressive requirements dictated by your plan, or through enforcement. Now, as we'll talk about later, enforcement is the place that we've seen the most use of integrated planning so far, just because those communities who are in enforcement action have seen the greatest need for it. But the agency is looking for communities that could proactively take advantage of integrated planning who are not in enforcement action, but could use permits or other mechanisms to demonstrate the value of integrated planning. So those are the basics, what the framework contains that EPA has given us. So the next thing I want to talk about is what exactly can be integrated. The answer is really anything. So if you have issues with any of your systems, your sanitary system, the combined system, your stormwater system, wastewater management, your treatment, if you have treatment plant upgrades that need to be accomplished, if you're developing an asset management program, long-term O&M programs, stormwater management, source water protection, non-point source control. If you are developing a program to address issues in any one of these areas, if you need more flexibility from the agency, then it might be good to consider integrated planning as a tool to obtain that flexibility. Now, you'll notice that drinking water is not on the list. EPA has made it clear that this is a Clean Water Act initiative only, so they want the plans to focus on Clean Water Act obligations, although the source water protection here is included. However, the agency has also made it clear that the cost of drinking water compliance can be considered in your affordability analysis. So if costs on the drinking water side affect your ability to fund Clean Water Act obligation, the agency is willing to consider those, even though the drinking water portion will not necessarily be included in the integrated plan itself. So when you're thinking about what can go into an integrated plan, it can be obligations that arise from any Clean Water Act program. So it could be embodied in your permit, in a TMDL, in an administrative or judicial agreement, just about anything that the Clean Water Act requires you to do could be part of an integrated plan. So that's what can be integrated. Now I'd like to talk about who can integrate. And this, again, as Chris mentioned, it can be tailored by community. Anyone responsible for implementation of Clean Water Act obligations on behalf of a community can participate in an integrated plan. And it can be any combination. It just depends on what fits with your community and the issues that you are facing. It could be a city by itself. It could be a wastewater utility or sanitary district by itself, a stormwater utility, a watershed authority, or any combination of those. In addition, you can talk about varying geographic areas. You can have a regional utility with its satellite communities. Anybody who is under a Clean Water Act enforcement action or not. Anyone who is negotiating a consent decree in an enforcement action, or even if you already have a consent decree, you can consider an integrated plan if you're thinking of renegotiating. So I want to give you a few kind of brief illustrations of communities that are using integrated planning right now. These are all in the enforcement context, as that's the most common at the beginning. But what I want to show you with these examples is that it doesn't matter. We've got a wide variety of problems, small, medium-sized, and large communities in a variety of regions. So I'll talk about these examples, and hopefully that gives you an idea of the breadth of opportunity that's available through this initiative. So our first example is a very small Midwestern community. They're facing pretty severe financial conditions, loss of industry, loss of population. They're in an enforcement action that's focused on CSO, SSO, and wastewater treatment plant upgrade issues. So those three elements will be part of a negotiated consent decree, and they will also go into the community's integrated plan. In addition, the community is facing future stormwater utility requirements, a nutrient TMDL, nutrient criteria rulemaking, and some other state issues. Those elements will not necessarily be part of the negotiated consent decree, but they will be part of the community's integrated plan. So the reason that this community considered integrated planning is to find some additional flexibility as they negotiate their enforcement action. They want to be able to prioritize investments to address their greatest water quality problems first. They want to establish reasonable levels of control for their CSO and SSO. I think this is an important point. EPA focuses a lot on the fact that the Integrated Planning Initiative is meant to affect sequencing and prioritization most of all. And EPA makes it very clear that it's not meant to change fundamentally the Clean Water Act obligations. However, an integrated plan can help justify the choice of the level of control if you are negotiating a long-term control plan or an SSO elimination plan. So it really can affect more than just sequencing in this context. So this small community is looking for a very long-term implementation schedule. They've looked not only at the agency's affordability guidance, but also at revenue requirements and their bonding capability, which has been hampered by economic conditions, to come up with a long-term implementation schedule. And they're looking toward the Integrated Planning Initiative to provide them the ability to use adaptive management as these anticipated future requirements come into play. So, for example, for this community, if something very expensive comes down the pike, they might go back to their CSO control plan and look at level of control there. They might look at their SSO elimination plan and see if modifications need to be made there based on the cost of future requirements. In addition, this community wants to incorporate asset management needs. They're aware that they don't want to create additional problems by ignoring the rest of the system while they focus on CSOs and SSOs. They may need a use sustainability analysis to meet water quality standards at the end. And the affordability analysis that's incorporated into the integrated planning process will help them if that becomes necessary in the future. My second example, also in the Midwest, this is a medium-sized community, and this involves both the city and the sanitary district. Initially, the city was subject to a CSO enforcement action as they own the CSO infrastructure. And then later, the sanitary district became subject to SSO enforcement because of basement backups and peak wet weather treatment issues. The state has done a bacterial TMDL, and there are going to be future nutrient standards that the state's working on developing right now. So the city and the sanitary district are working together to develop a joint integrated plan. They're going to do a combined affordability analysis for their entire service area. And one of their focuses here that they think integrated planning will help them with is better incorporation of green infrastructure projects. So they've got good ordinances concerning development and redevelopment requirements, and they want to be able to incorporate the improvements that they can make in getting water out of the system as implementation is occurring to perhaps make their gray infrastructure expenses a little smaller. So in this instance, they may need an extended implementation schedule, particularly if they're going to incorporate substantial green infrastructure projects at the beginning. And they also want to deal with environmental justice concerns. And here, the environmental justice concern is that the CSO community is concentrated in a low-income neighborhood. So they want to make sure that the neighborhood is not disproportionately affected by either the cost or the environmental impacts of these projects. So they think that integrated planning is going to be a good tool to allow them to achieve their goals. My final example is a much larger community in the Northeast, so a different-sized community in a different region. They primarily have CSO issues, but they also want to make substantial collection system improvements. Now, when they did the initial CSO long-term control plan, the agencies were demanding that they achieve about 4 overflows in a typical year. But then they looked at their long-term operation and maintenance needs and incorporated a 40-year O&M plan into their integrated plan with the CSO issues. So they have better coordination of the projects that would be necessary, the capital improvements, prioritized all their Clean Water Act obligations, and what they came up with was a means to justify a different level of control, 8 or more overflows in a typical year, because of the long-term O&M costs that they were incorporating into their plan. So they're going to have an asset management plan, which the agencies are very happy about, and they're talking about a very long-term implementation schedule. So those were 3 kind of quick illustrations, but what I hope you can see here is that we're talking about different-sized communities, different entities, different regions, and many different issues. But depending on your combination of issues, it may be possible for integrated planning to help just about any community. So the next question for you is, what about your community? In considering whether an integrated plan is right for your community, you need to look at what you're facing. Do you have competing water-related obligations that you need a good way to prioritize? Are there multiple entities addressing watershed issues? Do you have the community, a sanitary district, a watershed authority working on interrelated issues? Do you see in your Clean Water Act obligations the need for coordination among agency programs so that your permitting folks are talking with your stormwater folks, are talking with your TMDL folks? Have you found it difficult to get relief or flexibility from the agency in compliance deadlines, in how you incorporate green infrastructure and how much time you get to incorporate green infrastructure? Or do you need flexibility to incorporate adaptive management concepts to deal with what you know is coming down the pike? An integrated plan might be right for you if you have an existing CSO or SSO elimination plan that you think needs to be revised, either because it's become too expensive or because you figured out a better, cheaper way to do it. So the things that you should remember here are, first of all, you don't have to do an integrated plan. You should only do it if it really makes sense. And if you decide that it makes sense for some Clean Water Act obligations, you don't have to include everything in the plan. So the plan can be as small or as large as you would like it to be. You can limit it to only those aspects where you really need relief from the agency and can take advantage of the flexibility that they're promising with the integrated planning initiatives. So a plan can be simple, complex, or anywhere in between. It just depends on what your needs are. So if you decide that you want to investigate integrated planning, how do you get started? If you think it might be useful, the process really isn't that different from your normal planning process. If you're doing a capital improvement plan or any kind of long-term planning process, you generally follow a process that's pretty similar. So for integrated planning, you first identify all your water-related obligations, define the costs and timing requirements related to those obligations. How quickly do you have to implement them, and how expensive are they? And then you look at your available resources. You, as communities, need to be good fiscal and environmental stewards here. So you need to kind of balance your Clean Water Act obligations versus the resources that you have available, particularly if you have economic limitations. You also need to evaluate the environmental and health impacts of the issues that your community is facing, and then prioritize. The goal here is to achieve the greatest environmental and health benefits within your available resources as quickly as possible. And then identify any legal relief you need to accommodate your priorities and your schedule. So you need an extended compliance schedule. So when you're talking about the legal mechanisms, you need to think about whether you would like to implement through permits or an enforcement order. As I mentioned, most communities have done this, have been looking at integrated planning in the enforcement context, but that's not necessarily going to be the case for all communities, particularly those who are not subject to an enforcement action right now. They still may be able to use integrated planning to help them, even if it's implemented through the permitting process. You also need to think about how you're going to measure success, how you're going to use adaptive management to incorporate future conditions, and you'll need to obtain public input throughout the process. So that's kind of an overview of the things you need to think about to get started. But what else should you do? If you're embarking on an integrated planning process, we always advise communities to engage the agencies, talk to them early and often. We frequently give EPA, the EPA region and headquarters a notice that just to send them a letter telling them we intend to develop an integrated plan, and here's what we think is going to be in it, and we'd like community to discuss, how this is going to be developed. Obviously, you're going to have to talk to the public. Public education and outreach is a big part of it. You want input from your community on integrated plan development, particularly on affordability and prioritization issues. What's important to your community and how much are they willing to pay? We also advise folks to consider political outreach to your state and national legislative delegations, and also to talk to other communities. Webinars like this and conferences where you can hear what other communities are doing is a good way to exchange information and reduce your learning curve a little bit so you can see what the early adopters are doing, what they've learned, avoid some of the problems that some folks have encountered, and just make your process smoother. So the bottom line, in kind of giving you an overview of integrated planning, is that it's not necessarily new, and nothing in integrated planning is new. It just provides a framework for communities to justify getting the maximum flexibility that's allowed under existing law. And we're having substantial problems before this. So it's not necessarily going to solve every community's Clean Water Act challenges, and it may not be necessary for everyone if you're not facing some of the challenges that this initiative was designed to address. But we do think it can be a useful tool to help you evaluate and negotiate your Clean Water Act challenges a bit more productively. So I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Erica, for that great overview of understanding integrated planning. And we do have several questions, so we'll take a few minutes for those. And the first question is, water plant residuals are regulated by a Virginia NPDES general permit. So can water plant residual treatment disposal be included in integrated planning?
You know, I haven't seen that question asked specifically, but if the Clean Water Act obligation, then I think you have a couple of choices. If there's a reason to include it in the integrated plan, you can do that if you want to work in, prioritizing compliance with those requirements. The other thing is, even if it's not included in the integrated plan, treatment costs for those residuals should be able to be considered in your affordability analysis. So I think the answer is yes.
Okay, great. Next question is, does the community have to be under enforcement action to do integrated planning?
And that's a really good question, because those are the examples that we've seen so far. That has been the case. However, EPA has made it very clear that the answer is no. It's just that communities who are under enforcement actions have a lot of incentive to find any tool they can use to obtain relief. So they're the first adopters of the integrated planning initiative. But the agency really is looking for communities who want to proactively address their Clean Water Act obligations, who are not involved or subject to enforcement actions right now, and they're very eager to talk to communities who would like to do integrated plans that can be implemented through permits.
Okay, thank you. Next question, given the limitation to permitted sources, is non-point source pollution really on the table? While a nice step forward, integrated planning, or it falls short of integrated planning and is more like integrated permitting. Shouldn't integrated planning involve much more?
You know, that's a good question. I mean, we always talk about, when you're looking at watershed problems in particular, a lot of communities can demonstrate that even if they turned off all of their discharges, CSOs, SSOs, and the discharge from the wastewater treatment plant, that wouldn't necessarily be enough to cure the water quality issues that you're seeing in your receiving streams. So there are definitely non-point source concerns in a lot of areas. EPA has said if the community wants to invest in non-point source controls, those can be included in an integrated plan, and the cost of those can be considered in your affordability analysis. But, when you're talking about what the community itself can do, this doesn't necessarily solve the whole problem, but the agency and WEF and NACWA and the Conference of Mayors are hoping that this initiative will provide a little bit of assistance toward reaching those goals. So no, it doesn't do everything, but we're hoping that it will be helpful in what it does.
Great, thank you. Next question. This is the first time I have heard that a change to the necessary level of control can be part of integrated planning framework. What I have heard is that they will only give the community longer to get there. So what do you mean when you say reasonable? Is it time or actual final level of control?
Well, the last example that I gave, the last illustration, the large northeastern community, it was very clear. Without the integrated plan, they had developed a CSO long-term control plan that achieved 4 overflows. With an integrated plan that considered all of their Clean Water Act obligations and the cost of those, they were able to justify a different level of control. So they went up from 4 to 8 overflows in a typical year. So while EPA doesn't necessarily point to examples like that, when there is flexibility in the Clean Water Act and regs in designating the level of control that a community has to achieve, an integrated plan can definitely have an impact.
Okay, thank you. Next question, please clarify the weight EPA will give to state-driven regulations like numeric nutrient standards and TMDLs. Will it be a strong consideration for EPA in driving enforcement timelines, capacity for improvement, et cetera?
Well, I think it depends on where your state is in the rulemaking process. We're seeing a lot of communities that know nutrient requirements, for example, are coming down the pike. And they know that compliance with very stringent nutrient limits is going to be very costly. So they're trying right now, without knowing what the final rules are going to be, they're trying to develop plans that include, what in the enforcement context, at least what we call reopeners. So you say, these are your priorities now based on known obligations, but we know there's a future obligation coming, and we can estimate the order of magnitude that it's going to be. And so your current plan can say, if nutrient control is required, we think it's going to cost this much, and if that happens, then we're going to have to reevaluate our scheduling, our level of control, et cetera, and build that into the plan. If you already have nutrient criteria and you know what you're going to have to do to your plant to meet it, you can incorporate those requirements into an integrated plan right now, including the known costs. And that should have an effect on how your CSO and SSO level of control is selected, what kind of other requirements are incorporated in your permit or an enforcement action.
Okay. Next question. Will regulatory agencies require an enforcement mechanism for other programs added to CSO and SSO plans?
That's a really good question, and I think the answer is it depends. In the first illustration that I gave, CSO and SSO and wastewater treatment plant upgrades are what the agency is really concerned about, and those were the subject of their enforcement action. So those elements will be included in an enforceable consent decree. The stormwater management, the green infrastructure, and a few other elements that the community wants included in the integrated plan will not necessarily be included in an enforceable document, but they will be considered by the agency in what becomes enforceable on the CSO, SSO, and treatment plant side. On the other hand, the agency has been pretty eager to incorporate asset management requirements into. They've been trying to incorporate it into permits, and they've been trying to get communities under enforceable obligations to do those. So, if you are a community that thinks they can benefit from an asset management program and it's of substantial cost, then you're likely to see the agency say, well, that's fine, we'll consider it in the integrated plan, but we do want that to be enforceable somehow, either through the permit or a consent decree if you're in enforcement. So I think it depends on how interested the agency is in the issue and how important they deem it to be.
Okay. I'm going to combine the next two questions, and they're about what can be included in the integrated planning framework. A question about whether dam safety and improvements and river levee district costs can be included in the consideration on our integrated planning.
Mm-hmm. Now, I would say yes to both, at least in terms of cost. This is an obligation that the community has. It's a water-related obligation, so I think both of those should be able to be considered, at least in the affordability analysis. It's more of a question to me whether those could be included under an integrated plan. The thing to remember is the integrated plan is the community's integrated plan. And really, if you're balancing priorities and investments in whatever obligations, you should be able to include those in your integrated plan. That doesn't mean that everything in your integrated plan is going to get incorporated into an enforceable document, either in a permit or a consent decree or something like that. So if it helps the community evaluate its obligations to include it, I think it should be included. And the costs should definitely be considered.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Erica. Again, there are still a number of more questions, but I want to make sure all our presenters have time for their presentations, so we may come back with some more here. But we'll move on, and our next speaker is Adrienne Nomura on affordability issues. Adrienne is a Senior Water Resources Engineer with Geosyntec Consultants. She has 28 years of experience helping municipal clients identify cost-effective and sustainable solutions. She has consulted for more than 35 cities and wastewater utilities, as well as state and federal regulatory agencies, other regulated entities, nonprofit organizations, and trade associations. And she has been assisting municipalities and the U.S. Conference of Mayors, Water Council, NACWA, and others in their dialogue with EPA on the affordability issue and integrated planning. And she's helping several communities with integrated planning. She's a licensed engineer in Michigan and holds MS and BS degrees. So over to you, Adrienne.
All right, thank you, Linda. Let's see. As Erica described, for some reason my screen froze up a little bit, but as Erica described, integrated planning really arose out of the demands of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and we sort of clearly as a group realized that there's three basic elements that can be problematic in terms of Clean Water Act compliance, and where integrated planning hopefully will offer some relief. And the first is schedule, and we have seen that EPA has moved off of their you can only have 20 years to comply position, and now we're sort of into a 25, 30-year horizon. But many of us in this field recognize that 30 years may not be enough, 60 years may not be enough, and so we still have a way to go on the schedule discussion. And then we've moved into the affordability discussion, and that's currently being discussed, and I'll go through some of that to elaborate on what Erica presented. And then there's a third element, which is really this endpoints issue, which is really not being discussed at all. And I just threw in sort of the emerging contaminants of concern, where we don't yet have in-stream water quality standards, so we aren't requiring wastewater treatment plants to meet end-of-pipe permit limits for things like triclosan. But I do think that in addition to what a previous caller raised about, can we get regulatory relief on, say, number of overflows, we're going to be looking at questions about whether, we need to look at water quality standards compliance a little bit differently. And this was one of my favorite quotes out of what we call the 12 Angry Mayors meeting with EPA and DOJ that really sort of kicked this off. And Mayor Suttle really said, look, EPA, if you're just talking about sequencing, or if you're just talking about giving us a few more years to comply, that's not going to work. We have to do more than just sort of rearrange these deck chairs, or, we have cities that are going to be facing, financial ruin. And so these are really important things that we have to think about. And at the key of this whole affordability issue is this 1997 affordability guidance. And Bob will elaborate on this, but what I want you to see is there's really this two-part test that EPA uses in this guidance. The first is that residential income indicator across the top, and then the second is the financial capability indicator, which are the rows. And then depending on where you score when they go through sort of this workbook exercise, you could either be in a low, medium, or high burden community. And EPA in this document acknowledges that these are just sort of general boundaries, but what happened is it was the only boundaries that EPA staff were given, and so they of course treated those boundaries as sort of bright lines and wrote much of this into stone. And in the document, EPA describes the way they came up with the schedule that you get, depending on where you fall, was working on normal engineering and construction practices that they probably got out of, the construction grant programs with, wastewater treatment plants. And then they basically said, if you're in a low, we think 3 to 8 years for your CSO plan is reasonable. If you're medium, well, you might get 10 years. And if you're in a high burden, well, we'll give you up to 15, but if you really have a hardship case that you convince our staff about, we'll give you 20. And that's where that 20 years sort of became no consent decree could ever have a schedule longer than 20 years. And just like that 20-year decision sort of came into being set into stone, so did the concept of 2% median household income as a residential test. EPA did acknowledge that 20 years was not set in stone, and then you started to see consent decrees with 23 years, 25 years, maybe 28 years. But it's unclear at this point in time whether they recognize that that 2% median household income should not be set in stone. And as a result of using this guidance to implement negotiations on CSO and SSO controls, before the mayors got into the dialogue with EPA, the typical EPA DOJ position was, you have to spend at least 2% median household income, and you can't have more than 20 years. You need to keep spending on your controls even if there's little or no benefit, and we'll decide when we think that you can't afford it anymore. And as Erica said, there was an acknowledgement that green infrastructure is a very good tool for communities to use in certain circumstances, but they didn't want any risk of that green infrastructure not performing as well as the gray infrastructure. And there was really this focus on not complying with water quality standards, but just eliminating overflows at sometimes, at all costs. And the water infrastructure or stormwater infrastructure needs of the community weren't even part of the discussion. So we had a whole lot of enforcement press releases with civil penalties and supplemental environmental projects, which essentially, the city is on the hook for. And cities were coming out as looking like they were criminals. And that was something that the mayors were like, look, we're not criminals. We want clean environments too. It's just a question of how fast and how much can we afford. And I would argue that as a result of this, you really had some unaffordable programs coming out of there. I mean, we're not talking about tens of millions of dollars. We're talking about billions of dollars. There were inflexible endpoints. If a city found a way to do something cheaper, then at times EPA staff was saying, well, if you can save money, we want you to do more, so you got to spend that money. There was, demand for more controls if the other sources weren't addressed. That's a case where that Erica described. You eliminate all the city sources, and your upstream contributions still keep you out of compliance. And we had places where cities were spending more on Clean Water Act compliance than they were on education. And so we also had limited adoption of green infrastructure, and then all the other environmental problems that cities face are essentially insufficiently funded. And one of the key things in the Midwest is the emerald ash borer, which has really wiped out all of the ash trees, and that has an environmental consequence for communities as well as aesthetic issues. And 10 years after EPA came out with this guidance, their Environmental Financial Advisory Board came out with a report that basically articulated many of the concerns that the mayors articulated, which is this residential indicator really doesn't adequately reflect the impact of these rate increases to fund these big programs on disadvantaged households. And it ignores essentially the impact of the financial health of the utility. And EPA was only looking at the incremental cost of the CSO and SSO program and not the cumulative costs. And Gary will show you how important that is later. And I would like to point out with this two-part test that there's really two definitions, and this is out of NACWA's report. Affordability is really the ability of an individual customer to pay without undue hardship. And what you have there is you might be able to say on average this program should be affordable, but what often happens is people that can afford to move out of the city and into an area where they don't have to pay high water and sewer bills, they do that, and that leaves the poor people that can't afford to move stuck with a higher burden. And then with financial capability, that's really the ability of the utility to finance the capital infrastructure investments. And one thing that really has to be considered there is the debt that utilities take on to fund these large programs, because those debts have long-term costs to the individual ratepayers. So in terms of the local issues, this median household indicator really doesn't reflect the actual costs or economic burden to the community. And that's why I question whether, this 2% really needs to be treated like it's set in stone. Why is it 2%? Why does it have to be averaged across the community? There's studies out there that show that the median household income really isn't correlated with poverty. So you could have a community like Baltimore that 25% of their population is below the poverty line, and when you look at the future forecast of these programs, you're going to drive a much higher percentage of the community into not being able to afford their bills. And the burden of proof to demonstrate whether the economic impact, if you consider a bunch of other factors that EPA says they will allow you to consider, the burden of proof really falls on the community, and it at times becomes very hard for a community to convince an individual regulator that this economic impact truly is going to be felt across the community, because a lot of it is hard to quantify. How do we forecast the ability to pay over long periods of time? You have to look at, the overall community health, and that's made up of residential, industrial, and businesses and landlords. And in terms of financial capability and local issues, is the current structure and that guidance does really not address the current tax burden, the cumulative tax burden on the city's individual ratepayers. It really ignores local issues like very high unemployment when it compares it to what the national average is. As I said earlier, a 25 or 30-year schedule may be totally unrealistic for a particular community. And that in negotiating these long-term programs, you often end up deferring spending on other infrastructure, which later becomes very problematic. That increasing debt burden can affect the financial health, an adverse impact on bond rating, and all of this really came to light with the 2008 economic crash, which had not been considered in any of the financial forecasts of the previous plans. So out of this dialogue on integrated planning, and after the framework was released, EPA in January of this year released a draft affordability framework, and they said, you know what, we need to have a discussion about affordability. And they said, these were the key elements that are in that framework, expanding the use of the benchmark indicators, looking at the flexibility in the Clean Water Act and how you would prioritize the projects that you finance. What are the limitations and opportunities with rate structures? One key issue there is, as a utility increases their rates, the people that are affected the most are those that are at a low-income disadvantage. And in many cases, EPA will say, well, why can't you just subsidize those rates? And in some cases, state law prohibits that. In other cases, it's not the right decision for the community, and I think that there needs to be a lot of discussion about rate structures and what those limitations and opportunities are. And the same thing with public-private partnerships. There are some instances where those partnerships can work out well for a community. There's some instances where it may not be in the community's best interest. There was also the recognition that there needs to be consistent policy implementation across the EPA regions, and this is problematic, and it's a discussion, and I think, as Erica said, that's why they recommend, when you're going to go down this path, that it's a good idea to notify the EPA region, as well as, in addition to the state, but also alert EPA headquarters, because this is an initiative that is coming out of EPA headquarters and is being a new tool that regions should be using, and whether regions embrace that with the same robustness that EPA headquarters might, that remains to be seen. And also incorporating other community-specific factors, such like as the Safe Drinking Water Act obligations into compliance schedules. And then in July, EPA came out with some frequently asked questions about, and there was a number of questions in there, not just about financial capability, but this is the list that came out of those frequently asked questions. And I think we covered a number of those. And in there, they did clarify that infrastructure rehabilitation improvement costs should be considered in integrated plans, and that life cycle costs and sustainability should be considered for alternatives evaluation. And so this might bring in the opportunity to consider things like reducing energy consumption, or whether you might have a solution that is less certain, but in the long run you think would be more sustainable, and you have the opportunity to present that and try to negotiate that. And so I'll just finish up with sort of areas where there may be agreement on the affordability and financial capability, and areas where we may be a little bit far apart, and we'll need to have concentrated dialogue and early implementers to try to bring some resolution to these issues. I think there's general agreement that longer schedules are needed. As I said earlier, how long is probably still a big question. Agreement that we need flexibility for implementing these Clean Water Act programs, and that really you can't just look at the cost of a particular Clean Water Act obligation by itself. And that, safe drinking water is key to public health, and so investing all of your city's resources into your wastewater treatment plant compliance, or reducing CSOs and SSOs while letting the drinking water projects go unfunded is really not good for public health and the environment. And also that we need additional information to bring it into those, if we're going to stick with this residential indicator and financial capability indicator structure that's in the 97 guidance, we really need to figure out how to bring this additional information into it to assess the burden on the ratepayers and then the financial health of the utility. Areas needing discussion, why are we using this 1997 guidance to establish sort of the baseline compliance time frame? Okay, that's the 5, 10, 15, 20-year thing, and then we're going to go in and look at all these other factors and say, oh, well, maybe you need another 8 years or another 10 years on top of that. I just threw in this cartoon because I think, and I used to be a former regulator, there's a concern that if you take a chance with the community, that something won't work, and history down the time will come back and say, oh, EPA screwed up, or the state screwed up by letting this community try this thing, and we've got to move beyond that. And the same thing is, this 2% really should not be set in stone. Another area needing discussion is this idea that you can still fund these very large programs by raising rates, and if you have customers that can't afford to pay their bills, you somehow develop an assistance program to make these programs more affordable. I'm not a city administrator, but I would guess to say that would not be a wise way to look at your problem. Whether it's legal, in the state, whether it's really realistic, is it going to result in undesirable impacts on a community's rate base where the industries say, you know what, we're going to pack up and go to the county, and then that makes it harder on the residences to fund these programs. It's a lot more complicated than just, developing an assistance program. There's also the issue of how to quantify, communicate, and reach agreement on the ratepayer's ability to pay, and to some extent the ratepayer's willingness to pay. We see in many communities that try to implement stormwater utilities to fund stormwater costs that somebody takes them to court, says it's a tax, and recently in Missouri, the state Supreme Court, ruled that stormwater fees were unconstitutional. So this is a problem. And areas, we need to look at the planning horizon. In the draft that EPA released in October, they did indicate that they want assurances that planned expenditures will be made. Well, if you're looking at trying to come up with a plan that is, a 20-year plan or a 30-year plan, it's awfully hard to really commit to spending that. It's much easier to commit to spending over your typical planning period, which might be about a 5-year process. And then finally, this whole cost versus benefit, and this gets back to the endpoint discussion. Within the CSO policy, you can look at what's called the knee of the curve, where you look at your water quality impacts or compliance, and you're minimal to severe, and then you look at the total cost of your project. So many start out, we've got severe impacts, we're not spending a lot of money, and then you add more projects, and you get to the point where the marginal benefit is very small, and it's very hard to justify saying, well, we have this one SSO, it only goes off once a year, and it only goes off when the creek is at flood stage, but it's going to cost us $20 million to take care of that. Does that project really make sense to put on the books and just keep moving it out over time, or do we need to change what the actual endpoint should be?
Okay. Well, thank you, Adrienne, for that overview of all of the affordability issues, and great comment or observation at the end there. We do have time for a couple questions. And so the first one here is, has the affordability discussion and analysis included the impact on local public housing authorities' capability of providing, publicly owned subsidized dwelling units?
I don't think that has been publicly discussed, but the city of Baltimore is acutely aware of the impact on their residences, and they, like many of the other large cities with lower income populations, will have a lot of public housing. I do know that EPA does consult with the HUD, but I don't know whether they've consulted on this issue.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, can you talk a bit about what utilities can choose to do with regard to low-income households and the choices in terms of affordability for those households?
Well, many utilities, the boards will set up lifeline rates. They will set up utility sort of forgiveness, or sort of a longer schedule time frame for the ratepayer to pay. There's also, I think the best example of this is the city of Defiance, Ohio, who was asked to completely separate all their sewers, and they were told that that was the best environmental approach. They started down that path, and they ended up with the mayor being accosted when he went to church, or when he was out on the street. People were taking showers at the YMCA, the duplexes. They would, shut down water use on one side, and everybody would use water use on the other side, because that way their rates weren't as high. And Gary will show you an example of how Lima tried to deal with some of this issue in terms of setting a lower rate structure for people that are more on sort of the fixed income. And I think the problem is that the people that are looking at this as sort of a general, what could we do, say, in D.C., or what could we do in another city? It's a lot of good ideas, but it's when you try to get down to actually implementing it. And I think it's really going to be very community specific, and it's probably going to be some communities willing to experiment. But in turn for that experimentation, I think they should be given more flexibility.
Right. Okay. Well, that's a great segue into how one example of how one community has dealt with this challenge overall, and so that's our next speaker, who's Gary Sheely. And Gary is Director of Utilities for the City of Lima, Ohio. He's 36 years of service in the water and wastewater field, with the last 26 as Director of Utilities for the city. He has a Class 3 operator certification with the state of Ohio, and he's active in issues including the EPA Great Lakes Initiative, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, Water Quality Council on Affordability, performance management, and integrated planning for long-term control plan implementation, which is what he's going to be focusing on here with his talk. And he holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Water Resource Management. So over to you, Gary.
Thank you, Linda. I want to really appreciate WEF and NACWA's confidence, I guess, in Lima to kind of let us tell our story and our experiences in generating this. And so I'll kind of start off here. Kind of an overview. We'll provide challenges, current integrated plan, and then the next steps. I guess starting out with what I really, before I get into some of the detail in the process, just so everybody knows, Lima is located in northwest Ohio. We're basically halfway between Dayton and Toledo, so you have a map, that's where you can find us. I will also say that we've been at this for 13 years. We were one of the first cities in the state of Ohio to receive a long-term control plan for our CSOs and SSOs, the Clean Water Act requirements that we needed to do. We developed that plan, we're starting the implementation, then US EPA came in and did a 9-minute control audit, and they took over control. And one of the challenges that we've had through this process, our original long-term control plan was about $65 million and a 15-year compliance schedule to basically do the work. When US EPA Region 5 came in and we started working with them on getting our long-term control plan approved, those numbers grew to approach $150 million. And then into the integrated plan process, we went to a 28-year schedule. So it's been a journey for us. This is one of the reasons why Mayor Berger here in Lima has been very, very active, and I think it's been referenced before that Lima's been very active in the Conference of Mayors, because the mayor continuously has asked that question: how did we go from $60, $70 million to 150? And it's been a chore to basically try to explain that to the community as these issues have started. But to go through our issues in the economic challenges, we're a city basically of 38,500 people that live inside the city. Our wastewater population is a little over 47,000, almost 48,000 that we service. The metro area around Lima, though, is about 75,000. And we have a strong outlying area that is serviced by a county sewer system. We have, we have to basically make balance in those areas. Just to kind of go through some of the other numbers here, our median household income is just under $27,000. It has been declining. As an example, the county median household income is right around $40,000. So what has been happening to Lima, as kind of mentioned before, we're continuing to concentrate the lower income families more in the city, and the middle and upper middle class basically continues to move out to the suburban areas, which is, I think, typical of a lot of urbanized areas. 35% of our residents are below the poverty level. This number is a little dated, but it's somewhere still in that range. And then the unemployment is also a little, not quite as extreme as it shows here, but it's in that range. When we go to the MHI, this regression I've kind of talked about has showed a consistent decline in the MHI over time, which is represented in this chart, and it just again leads to the local demographics in the communities that sometimes isn't fully recognized as Adrian said, in the formulas that the EPA uses. We also have had some reduction in our sewer usage over from 2003 to 2011, and some of it has been the loss of some industry, but a lot of it has been as rates continue to rise, industries and so forth, and we'll put in water conserving practices, and then that results in a loss of revenue that we have to adjust rates to try to keep up with. The city's affordability considerations, as we have defined it, to make this sustainable for Lima, rates must remain affordable. Minimize the adverse impact on low incomes, fixed incomes, and below poverty sector population. Adrian has went through a number of those same considerations, and I will say we absolutely face that at our local level. And as I kind of mentioned before, Allen County itself has, I'll say, a competitive sewer system, and all of our outside rate base basically is serviced through agreements with the county commissioners. And those agreements can be terminated, and it would basically, if we lose that customer base, then we would lose 25% of it, 40% of our revenue, and a significant impact to our MHI cost, as well as we really don't have, we have to maintain rates and structures that don't discourage our industry, and we can retain that process. And so, a lot of the concepts that the federal EPA basically are proposing is just say, well, continue just to, shelter the at-risk customers, then that really has a real impact on all these other segments in our community. Our proposed integrated plan amounts to a number of areas in which I'll go through in a little bit more detail. Early action plans, ways to basically show that we are investing in the environment, which is a goal that the agency basically continues to espouse for sure. Wastewater treatment plant upgrades. We were a community that received significant grant dollars in the late 60s and 70s, and basically a lot of that equipment now needs to be replaced, and so we need to look at that, let alone the mandates that basically were being put on the community. We are a CSO city, an SSO city. We also have stormwater infrastructure improvements. We are an MS4 community and have created a stormwater utility to help support that. But we also believe that if we would allow the mandates from the Clean Water Act that were being imposed on the community to only be funded and didn't address our asset management. We have a 100-year-old water system, as well as approximately a 80, 90-year-old wastewater system that literally it will collapse around us if we don't appropriately continue to rebuild that system. And then the proposed consent decree based on the integrated principles. So, those were the features that we basically have looked at our plan. In the proposed integrated plan, we have the first area, basically, as I kind of mentioned before, has all of the components in it. The early action projects were just to start initially with some some environmental improvement and system improvements that the agency wanted to see us move forward. Those projects were in our proposed long-term control plan, in the integrated plan, but most of them got memorialized last year in our Ohio NPDES permit. So we're undertaking, even though we don't have a fully approved integrated plan and long-term control plan with Ohio EPA, we are cooperating with the agency and moving some of these processes forward. One of the initial ones we're looking at is the increase in the wastewater treatment plant capacity first. It is as I kind of mentioned before, we needed to basically do some replacement in the existing plant, and when we looked at the marginal cost to improve capacity, to put greater capacity in the plant compared to building additional storage or those other alternatives, it was a more cost-effective process to do this. And I will say that when we looked at this, we're negotiating with the agency on storage versus tunnels and just the whole plethora of things that most communities that get involved in this find themselves. The plant itself will go from 53 million gallons per day to 70 million gallons per day of combined flow. We are a tertiary facility with a 25 million gallons of tertiary flow. We do discharge into the Great Lakes, so we have that higher level of nutrient and tertiary requirements. Following that process, then we'd implement the CSO controls, which would take us to 97.5% capture, a very high rated number. That would amount to a 5-year design storm capture. A lot of discussion with the agency over this. Their design standard basically has been for a number of years in the CSO area as 4 overflows per year. But in the integrated plan world, we basically were reflecting that we just could not afford to go any lower than the 5 and still be able to comply with the SSOs and some of the other areas that they were pushing us for. And then finally, the SSO area was a 5-year design storm for about 2/3 of our SSO basin areas, and then 25-year storms we negotiated back with the agency on Allentown, Coop, and West. Their original proposal, again, was, as they espouse, is that they need to be eliminated. We basically worked through the affordability of doing that and showed that we could not afford to basically eliminate all of our SSOs, which is in the range of about 35 of them in our community in the basins. And the 25-year-old referenced areas here, the Allentown, Coop, and West area basins, those have the greatest potential contact with human populations. There are around some larger apartment complexes and some schools, and so what we looked at is the sanitary, pathogen type of exposure to the residents, where the balance of them on the 5-year are more I guess, not exposed to the human type process. And again, this is all based upon the integrated plan approach of what was affordable. And then, as I kind of mentioned before, we have the renewal and replacement program. Our asset management system is in place, and we're funding that. And we've also developed the stormwater improvement systems to meet the MS4 requirements. And then a lot of this, again, was sequenced to achieve the greatest environmental benefits first. And what we basically looked at, and this is the overall cost structure. It's CSO, as you can kind of go through the total project's about $150 million, and breaking out between the various components there. The planned priorities projects with the most environmental benefit. Our CSOs, as I kind of mentioned before, are one of our higher priorities. And in this area, what we found when we did the analysis, that our discharges out of our CSO system was about 400 times what it was out of our SSOs. And so the agency originally, in our long-term control plan development, were originally focused on do your SSOs first, because that has a greater benefit to protect human life and human disease issues. And what we were able to show them through the integrated plan process is that the environmental benefit from doing these CSOs gave a much better return on the investment we were making, and so the integrated plan process did in fact allow us to put that in this sequence. And then our SSOs, we have no chronic dry weather SSOs. They're pretty much wet weather related, and based upon some design criteria that were allowed to occur many years ago. And then the majority of our SSOs also discharge into some stormwater systems. That helps, again, further dilute that. We've had to basically also work on the other program in the Clean Water Act, which is your MS4s and the illicit discharges, and we've been able to work through some language with Ohio EPA and work with the US EPA on being able to effectively manage those areas in an affordability type concept again. And then our CSOs discharge into the main stem of the Ottawa River, and where our SSOs are pretty much indirect smaller tributaries that already meet the water quality standards that were designed for them. And then we have done a lot of work with our hospitals and so forth, and been able to show that there's no increased risk, at least it's present in the local community, from the exposure from the SSOs. And this is the sequencing of the proposed events. Again, it's $148 million in 28 years. $87 million of it will be spent in the first 12 years. And again, part of the issue I'll go through here also is that when you use the criteria that the federal EPA uses on the CSO policy in their formula, we are at 2.6% of the median household income per their guidance. At that level, we have a third of our families, and as time goes on, would even approach further, would be well above the the 2%, which is kind of their where they want to give you additional consideration. In looking at the graph here, the early work basically is the wastewater treatment plant. The baseline at the bottom is our asset management, or is the stormwater, I should say, and then the asset management, and then the large blip here in the middle basically is when we'll be doing the CSO projects, which includes a large 9 million gallon equalization storage to help get us along with the plant improvements to the 5 overflows per year. And then the outliers on the out here is in fact the SSO projects, which again, we prioritize the CSO work ahead of the SSO as reasons mentioned. Yeah, this is one of the compelling areas that we presented to the agency regarding the impact on rates, and we were trying to try to make sense of all of these cost and how we would approach those costs. And what we focused on is the 2% of median household income and we've kind of talked about, Adrian talked about that, is that the appropriate number, but for Lima, that is what we did. And then we looked at all the various rate scenarios. If we have no growth, we have effective growth, we have peak growth, the historical trends, all the items are listed there. And the bottom line of this is what we have is there's only 2 rate scenarios that would allow us to afford to do the 2% of median to do these projects and still be within the 2 or around the 2% of median household income. And that, as you see, is peak growth with average inflation. We went back over the last 15 years and looked at the growth of the community and of our sewer system. And basically, we can show that we had met this basically before the downturn in the economy. And what we projected is that we could see those type of events reoccur in the community. But it does put us at a risk for, if this doesn't materialize, then we basically, we'll face some additional consequences of that. And this next slide, the first part of the slide is the last slide we just showed, but we, after we get everything implemented, we have to continue to pay, because our payback over all these projects is basically 60 years approaches 60 years. So this 2% of median household income, again, number we reflected back on that for us to be able to do the projects, we need to have these growth parameters basically reach this point. Otherwise, you see what can happen if our growth doesn't occur or if inflation goes out of control. It just takes these rates well above what anybody in the community could even afford. Again, the next slide would be affordable implementation. The plan requires very optimistic economic conditions. And again, it's a peak historical growth of about 1.5% per year. And then we basically would see just an average inflation event basically over time of right around about 3%. And what this is basically shows is that on our sequencing of our events, we have, again, the early on would be the wastewater treatment plant, we have the basins, and then we have the SSOs, and then over time we can meet this 2% of median household income number, which allows us to have the affordability. The 28-year construction schedule that we basically developed was a reflection of this screen. If we would try to do these projects in a more tighter time frame, then we would start compounding our debt service. And if we compounded our debt service, then it's going to drive the rates beyond where they would be reasonable in a reflection of the 2% of median household income. The next slide, and Adrian, you kind of mentioned this, in looking at the local community, and I got to say this is a local flavor that we can absolutely reflect over in Lima. The county's anticipated rate structure for their SSO fixes that they need to make basically is about a $50 a month sewer bill. And when you look at Lima's median household income, as a sewer rate would be $50 a month. And what we had prior to last year, we had a variable rate basically, or volume-based rate structures that we would charge our customers. So if you used, if you were inside the city, you would use 300 cubic feet of water. You had been at $14.69. Last year, we went to the flat rate, and we've raised that to 26. That same person outside was at 26.59, or well, excuse me, they were at that's for 2069. They went to 45.23, and so basically what's reflected here is we eliminated any surcharges to the outside customer for our sewer, and over a 9-year period, we're going to bring the inside rates up to the $50 a month for our flat rate, a normal customer. We do maintain a conservation credit, or for our smaller customers, usually which are our elderly, we do have a conservation credit customer at $45. So at the end of 9 years, we will have a flat rate system basically based upon the median household income number of the $50 a month customer. This allows us to be rate competitive with the county, and if in fact we would kept the volume base, you can see that by this our outside customers were well above the areas where they would need to keep us competitive, and we would be in jeopardy of losing that outside rate base. And this is a reflection of what needs to occur in our system reflective of the growth. And what we have is, again, we have the conservation credit customer, we have our standard normal customer, and then what happens is this is the 2% of median household income with no growth. This basically is a static number that occurs that over time you can see that we would basically reach a point where if we don't have the growth, we could not afford to basically do the projects based upon where our rate structure would go. If we get the growth we have projected, then we can basically keep that relationship where we can do the phase 2 work as well as the SSO work beyond it and still maintain that relationship with the 2% of median household income. So the next steps of where we're involved is the approval of the early action plans. As I kind of mentioned before, we have started most of those early action plans in the NPDES world with Ohio EPA. They're congruent with what our integrated plan would be with US EPA that we have put in their hands at this point in time. And we would believe that we are there. The approval of the integrated plan is, again, we're at, I think, a conceptual agreement on the long-term control plan and the constituents of it. And where we're at basically is negotiating the consent decree based upon the integrated plan world. And in that consent decree is the two major areas that we're having issues, or the areas that we're basically discussing with the agency are involved in two areas. One is developing a supplemental environmental project. Our mayor has a very strong conviction that communities that are stepping forward to meet their Clean Water Act obligations should not have civil penalties and things of this nature imposed on them in the consent decree. And so we're negotiating with the agency a supplemental environmental project to ensure that the dollars that we would have to spend in that area can be reinvested in the local community, just versus being put into the federal coffers. The other area that we are negotiating with the agency is on what happens if we don't see the growth that we as I discussed here, and in those two areas, and our rates basically start reaching a point where they would be unaffordable. Then we have to have the reopener or an adaptive management program that would help us basically work through these issues. So, and we believe we're making headway, but it's still early on, and we would need to see how all that would work out. The other area is that in this process, as you can see from the historical over the next 60 years, we know that we've got a TMDL on the Ottawa River. It was just done. We know there are nutrient criteria that we have to meet in that, and then you continually look at, as Adrian pointed out, we've got indocine disruptors and various other environmental agreements that basically are going to be imposed on communities, and we believe that the consent decree and the integrated plan world needs to be able to basically manage those areas. We just can't keep piling on additional obligations when we're got the resources of the community tied up for the next 60 years. And then the last item is the work on the Clean Water Act legislation. We, as I mentioned before, the mayor's been very much engaged in this area, and there's two beliefs from the mayor's perspective here is that, and the Conference of Mayors would be, is that either Congress would step up basically and provide additional funding to fund these major capital items, or subsidy relief needs to be provided to local communities. And particularly in areas where the agency, the U.S. and Ohio EPA continues to believe that they have no discretion because these mandates are within the Clean Water Act now, and where I think a lot of us believe that they still have the capacity to be flexible in those areas. And then that leads to my last slide, which is a document that is being worked on. It's been proposed by the U.S. Conference of Mayors. I know this is just a framework of it here, and then there's an attachment that you can acquire, basically, which is a one-page summary of this act. And what we basically believe is that this may be necessary, and it is something that we're asking most communities, or the communities, to basically take a look at, see what's in it, and see what it would be advantageous to them if they have other additional suggestions, and get that back to WEF, get it back into NACWA, back to the Conference of Mayors, and so forth. And if you need to obtain this document, you can get it through the U.S. Conference of Mayors website, or you can also send a request to my contact hour or contact locations here, and we can provide that for you. With that, that's my presentation.
Thank you, Gary. Really appreciate that presentation, which is a great illustration of all of the affordability challenges, as well as just how to try to begin to address them with integrated planning and, of course, some of the initiatives that you just talked about. In the interest of time, I'm going to move us right along into Bob Rauscher's presentation. And then what we'll do is we do have a little bit of flexibility to go past 3 o'clock for some of the many questions that continue to come in, and it's great that we have so many questions, which we'll try and get to as many of those as we can. Bob is going to talk about the guidance that has been prepared. He's a founding partner and principal at Stratus Consulting. He has more than 30 years of experience in economics and regulatory policy analysis, so he brings some great expertise on costs and benefits of addressing regulatory mandates. He has a PhD in natural resource economics and public finance, and he also has experience from having served as the chief of the water economics branch at EPA from 1980 to 1986. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Bob.
Yeah, thank you very much, Linda, and thank you out there for listening in. And those first 3 presentations certainly have been quite excellent and very informative. I'll try to go through some of this quickly so we have time for questions at the end. Let's see. So there's some new affordability assessment resources that were recently published. One is an issue brief. It's about an 8-page easy read that's called Assessing the Affordability of Federal Water Mandates. And there's accompanying that a tool that we've developed, the Affordability Assessment Tool for Federal Water Mandates. These have been jointly sponsored by WEF, AWWA, and the U.S. Conference of Mayors. They're available for free. So if you're interested, I suggest you find these, download them, and take a look. In the tool itself, there's some background on affordability issues. We discussed the limitation of EPA's approaches, and some of these issues have come up in the previous presentations. We suggest some alternative metrics in different ways people and communities can look at affordability. We point out where you can find the relevant data to do the basic EPA analysis, and also some of the alternatives we suggest, and there are spreadsheets and templates that you can use to do so. The objective is to enable cities and municipal utilities to develop and present affordability analyses for their federal and state water-related mandates, and more specifically to help utilities better position themselves when they're talking to EPA or their state primacy agent, positioning themselves to make a compelling argument why some of these actions may not be affordable, and how some changes in the mandates would help with affordability concerns. We all know that there are impacts of federal water and wastewater mandates for residents. You're increasing the water and wastewater bills, and that can be particularly challenging in lower income or fixed income households. For businesses, of course, you have the same challenge. You're increasing the cost of operating. And for the utility and the community as a whole, you're straining the fiscal capacity of the community and the utility to undertake not only important water and wastewater activities, but other things. I know there was mention earlier of spending more on a consent decree than they were on education in some communities. The EPA, as most of you are aware, has offered some guidance and criteria on affordability through the years. They started in '95 with their first guidance related to this, where they discussed the possibility of changing compliance standards, and then in '97, the guidance that's frequently cited talked about relief via the schedule, and my understanding is typically EPA's relief has come with relaxing schedules, but from the earlier presentations, it does seem like there's some opportunities, especially with the integration approach of maybe re-examining what the ultimate targets are for compliance. It's also important to note that this is all wastewater oriented, and as the earlier speakers noted, that drinking water mandates are not factored into the analysis officially, though they should be, and EPA hopefully will take that perspective into account. In these guidance documents, again, this came up earlier, Adrienne talked about these, there's a two-tiered economic test. There's a preliminary screening analysis, which known as the residential indicator, and basically this is that 2% rule we all hear about. It's it is the average citywide wastewater cost or wastewater bill per household greater than 2% of median household income. And then there's a secondary screening analysis where looking more broadly at the utility and the municipality and the financial capability indicator based on a suite of fiscal metrics. And so this first screen, the residential indicator, this again is that 2% rule, taking the average water pollution cost per household and looking at median household income. And if you have a higher impact here, then EPA would want you to go to look at the secondary screening, looking at the utility financial capability indicator with these different scores for different indicators such as bond rating, unemployment rate, property tax revenues, and so forth. One of the really important things in the guidance is, and as articulated in EPA's 2001 version of it, though also mentioned in the 95 guidance, is that states and utilities as well can use different approaches, alternative analyses and criteria to support their determinations, and explain why these alternative analyses make sense. And that's really where we're heading, is to say, the 2% rule and the financial capabilities indicators, they're very limited and oftentimes misleading indicators, and there are other indicators that you can use. And so Simon Cowell is not happy with EPA's residential affordability index, and for good reason. It's a poor indicator of affordability. It does not capture impacts across highly diverse communities. As mentioned earlier, why 2%? Why not 1.5%? There's no sound reason to pick 1% over another. Median household income is a very poor indicator of economic distress in a community. It's a snapshot approach at a point in time, and you don't capture the impacts on landlords, public housing authorities, businesses, and so forth. So better measures would include looking at at-risk households by looking at the whole income distribution within a community, looking at the poverty rates within the community, unemployment, looking at differences across neighborhoods, which can be important across household types. Are we looking at the elderly? Are we looking at renters as opposed to others? And there are other measures of economic need. And they're also important to consider other non-discretionary spending burdens that are faced by some of the lower and fixed income households in various communities. And there are also important limitations on the EPA's utility financial capability. One of them is looking at local unemployment relative to the national rate. And this is a graph for New York, and we don't have time to go into it in detail. But when the national rate gets high and close to 9–10%, it's in a municipality that has high unemployment itself, because it doesn't differ significantly from the federal rate. It makes it appear misleadingly that higher rates may be affordable. Another part of the limitations for the utility financial capability is, property tax burden is a focal point in EPA's approach, but a lot of municipalities go far beyond property tax and rely on other metrics, other measures, other forms of taxes and fees to collect their revenues. And so if you're only looking at property tax, you're getting a very misleading picture. It's also important to recognize that the ability of local governments to finance major capital improvements has deteriorated considerably, and basically the economic realities that were in place in the mid-90s when EPA came up with these metrics has changed quite a bit. And a lot of that's due to, the financial crisis we've seen, flight from a lot of old urban centers to the suburbs, and also liabilities, unfunded liabilities in particular that municipalities carry for pensions and so forth. So, what's a utility to do? Well, we suggest you look at this guidance that we've put together with WEF and AWWA and the Conference of Mayors. So the guidance provides background on affordability issues. It talks about the limitations of EPA's approach. It presents alternative metrics that can be considered and how you can derive those alternative metrics and present them. It tells you where you can find the data you need to do that and offers spreadsheets and templates to help. So it's a very practical tool to help any community look at its own affordability issues and develop metrics and present them effectively to EPA. Additional issues we raise in the guidance are, and as others have touched on, the need to consider drinking water mandates and other water supply spending needs, which are part of the community's total water obligation and needs. And need to enable localities to prioritize across all their water-related investments. And here again, it ties into the integrated planning and permitting program that has been discussed. These next few slides give you some examples of where you can run into important issues with using median household income, for example. So the gray bars here are the U.S. This is the U.S. Income distribution. Now, once upon a time, EPA thought the median household income was a typical household. But if you look here, median household income is somewhere in this range. This is the least typical population group. Far more households are in one tail or the other. So the median household is not typical anymore. Maybe in the Ozzie and Harriet days they were, but that's not the reality of the U.S. in 2013. What's also important is in a lot of urban areas you have disproportionate number of poor. So this blue line here reflects the income distribution for Atlanta, and we've done this for other cities as well, and it's a fairly typical pattern, is you have a lot of households down here at the low end. You also have some that are unusually rich. So, but you do have more here than you would expect than you see nationally. And so looking at the lower end of the distribution is really important in a lot of cities. And then even within a city, you have differentiators that are important. So here again, this blue curve reflects Atlanta's income distribution for all households. But if you take out the elderly and look at the elderly, and these gray bars now reflect the elderly, you see that a lot of elderly households, there are a lot more elderly households at the lower end of Atlanta's income distribution than there are in other parts of the distribution. So that, again, is an important facet at looking at affordability issues and something that needs to be communicated to EPA so they understand the plight of all these households at the lower end. You can also look at poverty rates and how they vary, not just city by city, but within a city. Here's some analysis we had done for New York, where the poverty rate, 15% nationally are below the poverty rate. In New York City, it's 20%, and in parts of New York City, such as the Bronx, it's 30%. So you have, again, parts of the service area that are really already very, very vulnerable to any sort of rate increase for an essential commodity. So we've there are other ways of looking at this. Here's some other metrics that we have demonstrated: average bill as percent of median income across the income groups, percent of residents under the 2 or over the 2% threshold, and so on. And so here's an example. If you break out your income categories, you can see that for what ends up being about half of the population in Butte, Montana, you have considerably over 2% of median household income for wastewater services. Another way of looking at this is, again, by neighborhood. We went and looked at census tracts in New York City. And again, while on average New York City's wastewater bill is currently under 2%, there are whole neighborhoods, the red ones here, that are where the wastewater bills are already above 2% of median household income. Yet one more metric is looking at how much wastewater bills and stormwater bills can increase before you hit the 2% threshold within a community or within a census tract. And again, the red and the dark orange, reflect where 25% increase would throw these additional communities above that 2% threshold. So in summary, we have developed this guidance with WEF, AWWA, and the Conference of Mayors. It helps utilities consider which metrics to apply to their community, going above and beyond the ones that EPA specifies, provides the specific data sources and instructions for how you can access them. It offers spreadsheets and templates so you can put your data in and generate outputs. And it talks about the need to look more broadly at all the water-related obligations and needs facing a community. And also highlights where environmental justice issues can be raised because, again, depending on who these poor households are, the elderly or concentrated in certain ethnic groups, you do get into issues of environmental justice. And with that, thank you and ready for questions.
Thank you, Bob. That's a great overview of the affordability guidance document. I know there's a lot of detail in terms of just, applying it, so appreciate that, just grounding in everything that's in there very much. And there's some questions that we have that are kind of clarifying questions, I guess, if you will, a couple different ones about the median household income criteria and whether that includes water, wastewater, and stormwater, or whether that's just incorporating wastewater. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, my understanding is that the 2% metric is for wastewater-related investments, and so I believe that includes CSO controls and stormwater as well. Drinking water is not typically included in that, and there is kind of a separate. There isn't a comparable metric for drinking water, but there was an affordability assessment for small system variance technologies under the Safe Drinking Water Act that where EPA was heading towards the 2.5% metric. So it has been kind of inferred widely that if you add the 2.5% for water supply and 2% for wastewater and stormwater management, you get a 4.5% affordability metric for all water and wastewater related needs together.
Okay.
Hopefully that answers the question.
Yes, no, thank you. That's great. And I know we do anticipate that EPA will be coming out, I believe it's early 2014, with additional guidance and clarification on the affordability issue, correct?
Yeah, it's my understanding as well.
Yeah, okay. There's also a question, I'm not sure if you might like to try to take this one on, Bob, and we can certainly see if others do as well, which is related to the expected nominal annual increases in rates. Just wondering if you have any perspective on what that might be, and we can certainly open that to other speakers as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's going to be specific to each community. When as you look at each community looks at what's coming down the pipeline, where they're going to be investing in upgrading infrastructure and operations, and how that's going to affect their rates. There's not everybody will have a different kind of pathway of how their nominal rates will increase over time.
Fair enough. That makes sense. Maybe one more question on the affordability issue, and then there are a couple questions for Gary as well that I'd like to try to get to him in the last few minutes here. question relating to maintenance of the system, and certainly many communities are trying to catch up with maintenance of their water systems, and so the question is, how does that get factored in going forward into the affordability question, the affordability issue?
Well, if the question is about kind of operating expense as part of kind of ongoing operations and maintenance, then again the community should factor in, what its plans are in terms of increasing spending in future years. With infrastructure renewal, if it's really about repairing and upgrading or replacing, key infrastructure, sewer pipelines and water mains, then it can be a little more complicated depending on how they're being financed. But often, given that these are large investments needed year after year, that debt financing is ultimately somewhat limited, and it may make more sense to look at it in a more of a pay-go context.
Right. So maybe to just elaborate, then it sounds like it is important for the community to consider what that investment needs to be going forward as it looks at the affordability of all of the investments that need to be made. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks. So in terms of some of the other, we have a lot of questions. We're certainly not going to be able to get to all the questions that we have here, but I did want to ask a couple of questions for Gary, and the two in particular are, Gary, there was a question about whether there had been consideration of green infrastructure in the integrated plan that you prepared.
When we first initially got involved with Region 5, there were we had a significant part of our CSO work was going to include, or a good portion of it was going to include some green infrastructure involved in it. And I'll be frank with you, we got involved in the actual negotiations of the green infrastructure, and it was this assurances that was going to work question became, and we were pretty much at that point in time. Now, I think this was, probably 6 years ago, and I think the agency has kind of modified their approach now, but at the table it was pretty much they would not give us any consideration for the expense of the green infrastructure until such, if it did not work, and we would be held accountable for gray infrastructure still to meet that point. And so we reached a decision point at that point in time in the long-term control plan to basically say we're going to go gray infrastructure, and basically backed off of the green infrastructure. Now, that said, we're through our MS4, we're applying a lot of green infrastructure throughout the system. The MS4 and the stormwater utility, even in the combined sewer system, applying. So if we have entities that basically put in impervious pavement and they do rain gardens and stuff like that, they can save dollars on an annual basis for their stormwater utility charge. So our program, I'll say, is more informal than it is formal per se in the document, and that mainly was from the initial approach from the Region 5 or the agency in wanting, absolute guaranteed, performance standards that just weren't there, 5 to 7 years ago when we first went into it.
Very good, very good. The other question is whether, or maybe it's already available, or could your plan be available to folks to take a look at?
Linda,
absolutely.
Sorry, if I can just throw in a comment for a minute. We've reached the end of our webcast time, so if you're an attendee online and you have another meeting to get to, but you're interested in getting PDHs, don't worry about staying until we finish. The speakers have graciously agreed to stay on a little longer to answer these questions, but you're more than it's fine if you log off. Go ahead, Gary. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Rebecca. So,
Okay,
Gary, the question about your
here.
plan, yeah, is it available?
Yeah, it's available. We have a number of PowerPoints. This PowerPoint would be available, and we have a more enhanced version that we gave to US EPA and Ohio EPA. And they, on my contact, they could send me an email, and I would most definitely make those available to them. The document isn't fully accepted as of yet, but we believe that we're, as I mentioned before, we're at substantial agreement on at least the terms of the long-term control plan.
Okay.
One of their questions, if I might, on the request of the rates, the program we have put together is a 28-year program, and for the next 28 years, we're going to have a sewer rate adjustment each and every year, and they'll range anywhere from basically about 5% to 9%. And that's what's necessary to get us where we're at. On the overall scheme of things, when we're said and done, the $50 sewer bill will be about $30 for operations and about $20 for the mandate requirements per the average residential user, that $50 customer. Our industrials and sewers and commercial rates are all still volume-based and has a mandate component on it that we call mandate. It's the Clean Water Act mandate, and we're specifically building our bills that's a call out on the bill where people understand, why their bill's going up. It's not the O&M side per se. It's more of the increase that basically we face with the mandates.
Right, so you're making that visible, if you will, to your ratepayers.
Right. Yes.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That seems like a great strategy. Well, with that, I know we have people who need to get on to other meetings, so I just want to close with an observation or a comment that was entered during the webcast, which really was not really a question, more of a common observation, that it just seems like the integrated planning approach is just good budget practice from the ratepayer's perspective, and I think all of the speakers would agree with that comment, and the organizations that have been sponsoring this webcast today. So again, I want to thank all of our speakers and our participants today for your attention, and I know we have a few follow-up announcements, so if you could make those, Rebecca, that would be great.
Well, we have many, many unanswered questions, so hopefully the speakers can maybe respond to them in writing, and that's something we can add to the FTP site. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you for the speakers, and Linda, thank you for moderating. I really appreciate it. But everyone have a good day. Thank you so much.
The organizer has ended the session, and this call will be disconnected. Goodbye.